more blurry than what I'd be able to get out of the SS shader itself. So you can see if I go into the SSS2 shader, you do have the option to turn on diffuse, and I do have it available there, but I want to independently change the glossiness. So you can see on the top layer of the fast SSS2, I've got a different specular glossiness value, and I should probably have it on here too. I think that was set up just a little bit incorrectly. But let me just render off what the diffuse itself looks like. So just that material by itself, obviously the render is going a lot faster now, but just having a simple VRAM material and a correctly set up HDR produces a pretty decent snow shader in itself. But we're lacking those features that are visible here in the subsurface itself. So that is why I go in and add an extra layer to it. So I'm just going to render off the first SSS layer now. As you can see, the SSS feature is visible, but it's just much smaller. And the reason I've done that is because I only want it to show up in the small crevices and things like that, like cracks. Now lastly, if we go in and look at our reference again, sorry, let me just bring it up in Photoshop. Lastly, you can see there's large scale scattering, and that's visible throughout the whole thing. So this current layer is giving us the feature on the corners, up here and along here. Now we need the overall SSS shader, and this is why this base layer is the most visible layer in the shader. Now one thing that's happening here is when we do render off this entire layer by itself, this is where my point comes across trying to use multiple layers in the shader. When we do have a larger scatter radius in the material itself, we lose a lot of the small scale details because it's simply blurring them. But at the same time, we can't get that large scale effect any other way. At least that I know how. So now let me just cancel this, and I'll make another V-Ray blend material, and I'll just blend the two subsurface shaders together. And render this through again. As you can see, blending the two together now, we still have the large scale detail, but now we're starting to see some ridges and small scale bump and things like that that weren't there just with a single shader. So that's why I use both. But as you can see, there's one thing missing, and if I go to some reference here, it still just doesn't feel solid enough. And that's why I blend in a third V-Ray material, just to give it that last little bit of a solidity and remove this effect that is pretty obviously a V-Ray SS2 shader, if you know what I mean. Like you can kind of see when someone's overused SSS. Whereas when I was working with Octane, I felt like it was producing a much more photorealistic result, and you'll see that it's pretty exciting once I get into that in the lesson. So let me just cancel this. Now we need to take a deeper look into the actual settings I've used in this SSS shader itself. So I'm just going to go into this layer here. Actually, what I'll do is I'll just start from scratch and rebuild the material for you, just so that I'm not rehashing what I've already done. So I'm just going to make a fast SSS2 shader. I'm not going to change the preset. I am going to make the IOR 1.33. And I'm just going to add a small amount of diffuse to it. I'm going to turn on the background here just so we can see it. Now, in the subsurface color, it's probably a good idea to start out just with something that's a grayscale value. You don't want to complicate things too much, trying to blend the scatter color and the subsurface color together. Now, the scatter color is what's going to be shown in here. In these, the scatter color is going to be this color coming through. So I'm just going to set that up just to roughly what I think is going to work. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down into the multiple scattering. You can see it's set to ray traced. I'm going to leave that as is. In the single scatter, I'm going to set it to ray traced and solid. You can use simple if you're far away or there's not much detail, but to get a more physical result, I set it to ray traced and solid. Now it's also important to note that once again, in the render settings, I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, so I can drop the scatter subdivs, and I'm just going to leave the refraction depth to 5. Even though for something as simple as this object, I could probably go lower to 3. I'm going to tick scatter GI. In the specular glossiness, I can change that to whatever I really want, but as you can see here, you don't see very strong, sharp reflections coming through. If you give me a second, I'll just find a bit of reference where you can actually see a really glossy iceberg. So you can see here that because this iceberg's melting so much, the uniformity of the molecules making up the iceberg has become a lot more even, and therefore when that happens, we lose that rough surface appearance and it starts to become a lot more glossy. So what I found is that the more melted and more hot you want your iceberg to appear, the higher you go on the glossiness. So I'm going to set it to 0.5. I'm also going to turn on trace reflections, and once again drop those down to 0.4, and we'll just render this off where it's at just to see how this is looking. I haven't changed the scatter radius yet though, but I'll leave that there. So it's not a bad start, but like you can see, there's not enough of the subsurface appearance coming through. So in order to do that, you can do two things. You can change the scale, or you can change the scatter radius. It's the same thing. I'm going to leave the scale at 1, even though in these shaders, oh well, it's actually at 1 here. I originally had it at 100 because my scene scale wasn't set up correctly. So I'm going to leave the scale at 1, and I'm going to change the scatter radius to be about 20 centimeters, and just do a region render here. And as you can see, it starts to appear a little bit more soft. Now, the phase function is going to determine whether the material is forwards or backwards scattering. The interesting thing is I couldn't find any scientific data to determine whether or not it, like ice like this, behaves more like marble or more like skin. And I ended up speaking to a couple of old workmates. One of them recommended using quite heavy forward scattering with a scatter radius of about 10 to 20 centimeters. So I'll show you what both look like just to let that sink in. So this is with a value of 0.8 on forwards. I'll just do a little region render here and go minus 0.8. So the end result is that when you use backwards scattering in the phase function, the material becomes a little bit darker and the subsurface effect comes through stronger. And when you use forward scattering, less of the subsurface appearance is coming through and you get more of a diffuse value. Now, like I said, I couldn't find scientific data to back that up. So you're basically going to have to judge it by eye. But for now, I'll leave it at, say, 0.6. Now, there's one more thing to adjust, and that's the subsurface color itself. You can see I've left it grayscale at the moment, but what I did to add a little bit more realism was introduce a little bit of a tinted color so that I got the appearance like there was impurities in the ice itself. Now, not every single iceberg is going to have those impurities in it. You can see this particular iceberg is almost completely white, but when you do have material that's a little bit more rough and closer to the shore, you are going to be picking up some of those impurities that are in the water. And you can see here that when I zoom in, I'm talking about these areas here where there's just a little bit of color visible. So I'm just going to over exaggerate that color and do a region render. And you'll see what that does. Now the material itself looks quite a lot more dirty. And we're getting an over exaggerated feel of this here. So I'm just going to drop that off. It is subtle. I'm not saying go overboard with this. But I personally found it just added a little bit more to the realism of the image. It's probably still just too much there. It needs to be quite subtle. So that about wraps up kind of what I was going for when making the iceberg material. Now, depending on how large you want your iceberg to feel, just adjust these two settings here if you're going to use my specific shader. So if you have a much larger iceberg, I'd crank up this a little bit higher and drop this down, and I'll show you what that looks like. So using those settings, now the iceberg looks a lot bigger, and it looks a lot more like this as opposed to the small scale stuff. So you're getting more of this effect coming through. Now there's one last little thing that you might be wondering how to produce, and it's sometimes difficult to get it right away. And one little quick trick I do to get the effect I'm talking about down here in the water, this glowing effect, you can see it underneath. It's almost becoming brighter than above the water. You'll notice now my render doesn't actually have that. So what I was playing with to get that effect is just putting a light under the water. Just move this render out of the way. And when I was using the light, I was putting in a strong color just so that I wasn't giving the appearance of kind of a faked effect. I was trying to integrate that glowing look without over brightening the ice or anything like that. So let me just drop this in and I'll do a render to show you what that looks like. Let me just duplicate this. The difference is quite massive, and you can see very easily you can reproduce that effect that you're seeing here. It's not physically correct, and it will take just a little bit of a trial and error positioning where you want that. You don't have to use just one light either. Feel free to use it wherever you want. Let me just cancel this, and I can just move it under here to show you kind of how that can affect things differently. And I'll add another light over here. and just re-render that, but it adds a lot more life to your image. So placing the lights in that position doesn't look as good, and it just goes to show that, like I was saying, it's not physically correct, but if you just do a little bit of experimentation, you should be able to get a pretty nice result out of that. So that wraps up what I was trying to show you with this iceberg material. Now I just want to load up the snow scene, which uses pretty much the same way, just with modified settings, and I'll run you through that. So when I was originally looking for reference images to use and try and reproduce shaders for, I came across this really cool snow image that showcases how, under the right lighting conditions, snow can be extremely reflective and glossy, while at the same time appearing very diffuse and matte. So depending on where the light's hitting it, changes the way the snow appears. So in order to recreate this material, once again, it's based on 3 individual layers, except this material has a little bit more into it in terms of detail. So if I go into the base material here, and I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of this because I've already explained the settings utilized on the iceberg shader, and these are just modifications of those, but I'll just run you through the extra detail I've added into the scene. So in the dirt material, in the unoccluded color, rather than using white, I've just used a slightly off yellow color. In the reflection glossiness, I've used a splat map, which is a really nice procedural map for creating kind of flaky like highlights. And I've just had to modify those colors so that they're not fully black and white because it was appearing too matte. The whiter you go on these colors, the more reflective and glossy the material is going to appear. I've also got a bump map, which is just a composite of the splat map that we used in the reflection glossiness and 2 variable Bircon noise maps. And that was just to give a little bit more flaky detail that you can see here. Because one of the hardest things to reproduce when you're creating snow is that small scale speckling. In the first fast SSS2 layer, you can see I've gone for a very strong scatter color with a scatter radius of 30. And the top layer is a slightly darker color with a much smaller radius. So if I swap to the SSS2 layer of this shader, you can see the effect this is having on the scene, and it looks quite cool. Near the peaks and the highlights, you can see that there's that really nice color bending coming through the image. If I swap to the specular pass, you can see that it's quite noisy, but that's not because of anti-aliasing issues, that's because of all the bump mapping and things like that in the scene. And this was the biggest issue I had with V-Ray, trying to create those small scale bumps. I was much more successful in Octane. If I just bring up the image again, you can see in the shadows there is that subtle color coming through that I've tried to match as closely as possible. And the biggest thing preventing this from being photoreal is just a lack of detail in the model. If this was a production job, I would have gone in and created some displacement maps and bump maps and just manually gone in and added that detail in ZBrush. Instead, I've just tried to show you how I've created this specific shader. We'll just do one more render from another angle. So as you can see, from a completely different view, you're not getting any of those specular highlights. Yet when you look at the reflection, it's extremely reflective. So just be careful when you're setting up your snow scene not to make your material too diffuse, because it often comes down to the way in which light is hitting your scene. If I swap to the SSS pass, you can also see now when the light is behind us, there's a lot less coming through. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to cover in this lesson, and that was the Octane stuff. So I'm just going to load that up now and run you through how I set that up and how it's an extremely useful way to work. So the images you can see up on the screen here are all raw renders straight from Octane, and the reason they look so good is because Octane has recently added in displacement as a feature, and it handles displacement extremely well. So when you are zooming in here, this is all little granules of snow that very accurately represent kind of how real snow behaves, in that it's not just a flat surface with bump mapping, it's a very complex structure. And this is what I was struggling to reproduce in V-Ray, because whenever you use a subsurface shader with a surface that requires this much displacement, V-Ray ends up hanging, and it just takes hours and hours to get anywhere, let alone see something that you can work with. So some of these renders are quite large. This one, for example, was rendered off overnight. And if I just go full screen, every single one of these little flakes is a bit of geometry. And all the little highlights here are part of the shader itself. So the little pings are just an extra layer added that reflects. So let me just go into Octane now, and I'll show you kind of how it works. And you can see here in real time I'm just rotating around, and this is just one layer of the shader, and I construct it. If I just bring this shader network onto my main screen here, I'm constructing it in a way very similar to V-Ray. I've got a subsurface shader which is producing the snow, the blue tint through the snow, and then there's a diffuse material which also has some scattering, but that's producing the more solid appearance. And then I blend those two together into a single material here, and then lastly over the top of that I'm blending in a flake material, and that is blended in using a grayscale image of just some powder. So all I made is just I made a black and white grayscale image. Let me just load that up for you. So as you can see, this map I made is used to blend over the flakes. I'll provide all these maps in the scene files for you guys, because I do think they are useful. So there was actually quite a lot of assets I created for this that I'll package up for you guys. You can see here, if I zoom in, it's actually quite a complex map. I made this by using Forest Pack to scatter some flakes, and that's why there's height for it. That's why there's height as well. The displacement map I'm using, I'll also load that up. So if I zoom in here, it's a similar map to the flake map I used, but this time a lot more dense. So this is what's actually displacing the flakes, and it is tileable. So I'll also provide that for you guys. Now, what I did do is, after using Octane to set everything up, I did go back into V-Ray and try and use the exact same workflow to reproduce the effect, but it was just too slow. I couldn't physically get V-Ray to render snow out using such high-res displacement. So let me just apply the overall shader to the scene here. And you can see if I zoom in extremely far into the mesh, and just let that render quickly, you can see all the little flakes making up the snow, which I thought was quite crazy. If I go into the materials displacement property, I'll just have to pause this, sometimes it gets a little bit slow. I'm just going to drop the power down and reload. Actually, from memory, this power option wasn't working with displacement specifically. So in order to reduce the displacement effect, I had to go into the actual map itself and adjust that. But I mean, as you can see, the level of detail that Octane can produce, even just zooming in still even further, let me just fix up the autofocus here. It's quite crazy, and because it's real time, you're able to adjust all this stuff and get everything perfect. And the end result was exactly what I wanted to get, that nice powdery snow. So I will provide all these scene files for you. There's a couple of scenes I was prepping for within V-Ray also that I'll include that weren't featured in this lesson specifically. But I hope you get a lot out of these scenes, and I know that the overall soft snow feeling, I didn't get it in this lesson, but if I ever do, I'll just include that in the scene files, because V-Ray may be updated in the future and it may handle high-res displacement a lot better. Thanks heaps guys for sticking around and waiting for this lesson to come out. The next lesson I'll be producing will be the user voted lesson, so I'm going to skip to lesson 11. I think it's better to compact the hair and skin lesson together with the finale lesson, so do those two one after each other, because there is going to be hair and skin featured inside the finale lesson also. Thanks heaps guys, and I'll see you next time.